Alright, this will be a list of staple spell cards. Staple spell cards are cards in which you could realistically take almost any card from this list, throw it into any deck you're playing, and it would actually benefit you in some kind of way. So, first off, we have MST, Mystical Space Typhoon, the ultimate staple spell card. You'll see probably this in almost every single person's deck, no matter what. Dark Hole, it's pretty good. Golden Sarcophagus, it's a great way to search out for cards. It is good in decks even if you're not playing Dragon Rulers, but it's completely OP in Dragon Rulers. Book of the Moon. Oh, I should probably talk about why they're good. You see, Book of the Moon it has a whole bunch of uses. Basically all it does is flip a target face down, but since it's quick play, it can be chained to stuff. So if you flip a card face down, under certain circumstances it will negate some card's effects because they have to be face up on the field for them to actually activate. But that's only under very specific circumstances. Usually though, it won't negate effects, and the effects will still go off anyway, but then they'll just be face down. It can be used to stop an attack, because once you're flipped face down, you can't flip them back up if they've already declared an attack. Or if they just got special summoned out to the field, you can flip it face down, they can't flip it back up. Same thing if your opponent's about to go for an XYZ summon, they can't do it if their card is face down. So you flip it face down and they're pretty much stuck with a card up on the field. So if they use something like Tour Guide and they bring out another Tour Guide, you flip one of them face down, they can't go into a rank 3 and you can just destroy it on your next turn. Also, it can be used to reset certain cards' effects, like Lancer, whose effect can only be used once while it's face up on the field, similar to Wind-Ups. And Light and Darkness Dragon, once his effect is completely used up, you can flip it face down with Book of the Moon to reuse his effect. So it has so many good uses, and it's good in almost every single deck because it's so versatile. It can be used for so many different things. Same thing with Forbidden Lance. This card is the best of all the forbidden ones. There's Forbidden Chalice and Forbidden Dress as well. Forbidden Lance is without a doubt the best though, because what it does is it makes the target unaffected by the effects of spell and trap cards. Also, it lowers the attack by 800. So what you can do is use it to save one of your monsters, once you special summon on your turn, as long as they have high enough attack that you can still probably use them. Pretty much it's to protect your key cards from getting destroyed by things like evac device, send it back to your hand, or bottomless trap hole. It will not stop Solemn Warning though, because Solemn Warning is spell speed 3 and this is spell speed 2. So Solemn Warning will still negate your special summons, but other than Solemn Warning, it can stop pretty much anything else. Upstart, it can also be used, as a reduce their attack by 800 to actually run over your opponent's monsters. So it has two great effects. One to protect your monsters that you really need, and to run over your opponent who has a really high attack monster. Upstart Goblin, a very underrated card, which is an absolute staple in any deck. And in fact, it was actually limited at one point because they knew of its potential, but no one uses it nowadays. Well, except for Dark Worlds. Dark Worlds uses this consistently. What it does is it just lets you draw a card and your opponent gains 1,000 life points. What this essentially does, it's a hand neutral card that gives your opponent 1,000 life points, which isn't that bad unless you're going for an OTK, specifically 8,000, then you don't want this in your deck. But if you're going for a huge beatdown deck, then this card is absolutely, completely fine to be in your deck. Or if your deck isn't about OTKing in one turn, you can play it. Other than that, it's a great way to turn your 40 card deck into a 37 card deck, because drawing it essentially means you can just draw another card. Now, Pot of Duality is kind of like Upstart Goblin with a really bad side effect though. The side effect to Upstart Goblin is your opponent gains 1,000 life points, which isn't that bad unless you're going for a specific OTK. With Pot of Duality, on the other hand, you can't special summon the turn you use the card. But if you're running a deck that doesn't revolve around special summoning on your turn, that's fine. Or if you're running a deck which needs a specific card very early on in the game, then you absolutely do want to run this deck. You could even run it in decks that rely on special summons just to set up a combo better, because it allows you to choose 3 cards to replace this one with. That's pretty good. Night Beam, it's like MST except it's not quick play, so you can't chain it to field spell cards to destroy them before they get the effects off. You can't chain it to continuous spell or trap cards to destroy them before they can get their effects off. Because MST kind of negates when you activate a continuous trap card and you chain this to it, the effect will never go off because it gets destroyed. That's the only case in which MST kind of negates, because it does stop the effect from taking place. Same thing with field spell cards. But Night Beam, it's just the normal spell cards, you can only use it on your turn, spell speed 1 instead of spell speed 2. But your opponent cannot activate their card in response to this card's activation, which makes it better than Dust Tornado. Really, if you don't want to run MST for whatever reason, or if you want to run more than 3 MSTs, you throw in a couple Night Beams as well, because that secondary effect is amazing. So they can't chain their evac device or Forbidden Lance to it, because that's what people usually do, is they'll have a face down card which they can chain to an MST, but with Night Beam it just destroys it. Smashing Ground, Fissure, and Nobleman of Crossout. At one point in time, all 3 of these cards were limited, and I'm pretty sure they were all semi-limited at one point too, except Smashing Ground, I think. I know Fissure has been limited, semi, and unlimited. Same thing with Nobleman. I'm not 100% sure about Smashing Ground though. Basically, it's a costless destroy one of your opponent's monsters. And Nobleman of Crossout got rid of flip effect monsters, which were actually pretty prevalent at one point in time. Nowadays, people don't really run flip effect monsters except for Lightsworns, and I can't really think of any other good decks that run flip effect monsters actually. But it still does banish face down cards, so the only time people really play a face down card is if they're playing a deck that specifically revolves around them, like Ghost Tricks, or if it's the first turn of the duel, in which case this card's usually not a good draw later on. While these two are always good later on, but with a whole bunch of cards having the effects of not being able to destroy by card effects, they're not as good as they used to be when that wasn't really a thing and Stardust was the biggest problem in the game. Other than that, they're costless destroy 1 monsters. And Soul Taker. It's in the same league as these ones, except it does have the same cost as Upstart Goblin, where your opponent gains 1,000 life points. But other than that, you actually get to choose the card you want to destroy, so it is better than Smashing Ground and Fissure. But your opponent gains 1,000 life points. So if you're running a deck which your opponent's life points don't really matter because it's all about beating them down anyway, then Soul Taker is an excellent choice. But it's not really a good combo to run with Upstart, or else your opponent will be gaining a ton of life points. Otherwise, it is a really good side deck option too, in case your opponent is running 1 key card which you absolutely must destroy. And Soul Taker allows you to target a monster, so it's really good for that. Forbidden Chalice, it's not as good as Forbidden Lance, because it just negates an effect. But it is spell speed 2, so you can chain it to something, but it increases their attack as well. So usually you want to use this card on your opponent's monster when they're activating an effect, obviously, so it gets negated, but then they get a nice 400 attack boost, which isn't really that much. But the best part of using this is to use it on your own monsters who have some kind of negative effect, like, Beast King Barbaros, where you can use it on him and his attack will go back up to 3,000, plus he'll have 400. But other than that, the reason you'd want to use this in a stable deck is for the negating effects part, which actually isn't half bad. Scapegoat with synchros. I'm pretty sure this next format's going to be all about synchros, so Scapegoat is going to be very good for that. Plus, you can chain it to, your opponent's MST if they decide to destroy it face down, and you special summon out 4 tokens, which is great for protecting your life points. Instant Fusion. It's not as underrated as it used to be. I always loved using Instant Fusion because it's basically you pay 1,000 life points, then you get a free monster from your extra deck. The only downside is you have to actually run those kinds of monsters in your extra deck. So it's good for going for a quick rank 4 monster if you just normal summon one out, or even rank 5s, or if you just need tributes. So it's not really good in every single deck, but it is good in a large majority of them. And finally, Lightning Vortex at the very bottom. Basically, the only good spell cards that you could throw into any deck are in the top 2 rows. And the further down you get, the worse they are, but they're all still staples. And Lightning Vortex deserves its place at the bottom because it is a good card. I mean, it destroys all your opponent's monsters, but only their face-up ones, and you have to discard a card to use it. Now, if you're playing a deck where a discard cost isn't really a problem, then this card is great. If you're not, then... well, actually, there's only really 2 decks where discards aren't really a problem. That's probably Gem Knights, because they can refuel with the Gem Knight fusion. Infernities, because they want to get rid of their hand as fast as possible. And Fables, because their discards actually turn into a benefit for them. Other than those specific decks, it's fine to throw in, like for a side deck option, if your opponent is playing a really swarm heavy deck just to screw them over. Because I mean, it's 2 cards for up to 5, so it is a possible gain of 3 in field advantage, or a loss of 2 in hand advantage. So it's pretty good. It's actually really good. It's just that nasty discard cost, where we have Dark Hole, which does the same thing and it doesn't have a cost. And then we have honorable mentions down here. These cards aren't good in every deck, but they are really good for what they are. So we have One Day of Peace. It's a good way to, thin out your deck like Upstart Goblin without the nasty increase in your opponent's life points cost, but it does let your opponent draw a card as well. So the best way to use this card is during your main phase 2 after you've attacked. That way your opponent can't do any damage to you, because you take no battle damage or effect damage, so it's great against a effect burn deck. And your opponent draws a card though, which is the huge downside, because you don't want to give your opponent hand advantage. While this does ultimately make you hand neutral, it does give your opponent 1 card, which is the huge downside to this. But it's still really good, and that's why it's at 1, because it's a great way to thin out, to make your deck smaller in an OTK deck where you need to win as fast as possible. But you can't OTK the turn you use it. Mind Control is good in synchro decks, and probably nothing else, because there's other cards that do what it does better. Basically, in synchro decks, you can pretty much adjust with the level of the monster you take, or you can take an XYZ monster and just not really do anything with him, just have him out of the way. Or use its effect, like Steal a Big Eye, use Big Eye's effect, steal another monster. It's not really good in every deck. It is good in every synchro deck, because you can synchro with it. And it's not really good in all decks that rely on XYZ summons, because you don't really know what your opponent's levels are, and it's not as reliable as with the synchro deck, where you can just really adjust levels on the fly anyway. It is a good side option if you know your opponent's doing the same levels as you are. Like they run a whole bunch of level 4 monsters and you run nothing but level 4 monsters. It's a perfect side in, but other than that, it's only good in synchro decks. Monster Gate and Reasoning, they are really good in almost any deck, except for decks that use low level attack monsters. So if you're running things like Maxi or Evacueler, like most good decks do, you probably don't want to add these cards in, because there's a huge chance of bringing one of those cards out. If you're not running any low level attack monsters, or monsters you don't want in the field immediately, then it's probably not a bad choice. Soul Exchange is good in any deck that requires tributes of any kind. Same thing with Enemy Controller. It's a great way to steal your opponent's monsters, but it's only good in very specific decks. But its first effect does make it semi-staple, because it does, negate an attack, even if you don't use its good effect where you actually steal your opponent's monster. Forbidden Dress is not as good as Lance or Chalice, because it doesn't... Basically what it does is it cannot be targeted or destroyed by other card effects. And usually what you'd want to chain Forbidden Lance to is, like an evac device, or a card that banishes, like Dimensional Slide. And Forbidden Dress won't stop that, but it will stop it from being destroyed by card effects, like Bottomless Trap Hole, because that does destroy first before it banishes. So it's okay, it's just Forbidden Lance does the same thing but better. And it cannot be targeted, so If your opponent already targets the card and then you chain it to it, it won't really change anything because it's already been targeted before it was target immune. So it's good for an OTK with a really high attack monster that you don't want destroyed, but they can't... Well, actually, yeah, it's really good for that kind of things because it can't be targeted by Dimensional Prison, and it can't be destroyed by card effects. So it's really good in those kinds of situations. It's just Forbidden Lance does the same thing and better. And Heat Wave is good for, well, if you already have your field set and you don't want your opponent to do anything on their next turn, and it's really good at doing that. Other than that, it's not really that great, but it deserves an honorable mention as an option if you don't want to use all these other cards that are way better and you just desperately don't want to use trap cards.